Imagine surviving 2 months of storms on a ship to the point of breaking in half and sinking more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest settlement, literally, in the middle of nowhere, with vegetation bearing no fruit, hostile tribes around you, and hundreds of people depending on your decisions. This was the reality faced by Captain Anil San Juan, as reported in the tragic Maritime story, which details the worst shipwreck in history. A series of wrong decisions would lead to almost everyone in the expedition dying, the captain losing his sanity, and his wife having to bury herself alive in a struggle for their own survival. In today's video, we'll talk about the shipwreck of the Anil San Juan and how a series of mistakes shaped the most dramatic shipwreck in history. Portugal managed at the beginning of the 16th century to establish a solid monopoly on spices in the Indian Ocean. The country established itself as the nation responsible for bringing Indian spices to be traded in Europe, in a business that was highly profitable. To give you an idea, the spices that Pedro Alvarez Cabral brought back from India in his 4 ships generated enough profit to build and equip a fleet of 91 ships. In some regions, grams of spices were as valuable as grams of precious metals. And so, the Portuguese started designing increasingly larger ships to bring back more and more spices, all at once. And it was in this context that, in 1550, a shipyard in Lisbon began building a ship that would be designed for war. But during construction, they decided to convert it into a large merchant ship intended for transporting spices to India, and its name would be São João. According to the tragic maritime history, in February 1552, the ship was preparing for another return voyage to Portugal, under the command of Captain Manuel de Sousa Sepúlveda, a respected military man and merchant from the Portuguese possessions in India. On February 3rd, the São João departed from the city of Cochin, carrying tons of pepper, Chinese porcelain, and other goods. And on board, there were about 600 people, and even without carrying all the planned cargo, the ship set sail. The ship set sail extremely heavy, which worried some crew members. But despite that, Manuel preferred to continue the journey that way. 2 months after leaving India on April 13th, the crew of the São João sighted the African coast for the first time. The ship, however, was already quite delayed. Besides the enormous cargo it was carrying, it had faced strong storms while crossing the Indian Ocean. These storms battered the vessel and severely tore its sails, and since those were the only ones available on board, the crew had to keep sailing even with the damaged equipment. As they sailed along the coast of Natal, in southeastern Africa, the sailors finally encountered favorable winds. But this improvement didn't last long. Although they were within the dry monsoon season, the rainy season was beginning to approach. And the fact that the ship was extremely heavy and sailed slowly with torn sails caused it to fall behind, to the point of facing a change in the weather. Thus, contrary winds began to blow when the ship was about 150 kilometers from the Cape of Good Hope, and controlling the vessel became extremely difficult. Manuel and his officers then needed to decide what to do. They could continue facing the contrary winds, but that would mean losing the entire sailing season. But they ended up choosing the third alternative, turning the ship to try to take advantage of the winds, but it was already too late. A new storm, even more violent, was approaching, and so the São João was surrounded by unpredictable winds and huge waves that threw water over the deck. The threat of a shipwreck was becoming more and more real. Faced with a large amount of water entering the ship, Manuel ordered that much of the cargo be thrown overboard to lighten the vessel, but this had little effect on the ship's maneuverability. For the next 27 days, the ship and everyone on board were battered by bad weather and successive storms. Between one storm and another, the crew assessed the damage and tried to repair the vessel as quickly as possible. But the mainmast, The mainsail and the rudder were completely destroyed, with no way to repair them. The ship's carpenter also reported that 3 of the hinges that supported the rudder and helped control the ship's direction had disappeared. And upon hearing this, Manuel ordered that the information be kept secret, fearing that the news would cause panic among the crew. But the ship's condition was exaggerated, obvious to everyone. And so, in that interval between storms, they tried to make improvised repairs. However, whenever a new storm arrived, all efforts were quickly destroyed by the force of the ocean. On June 8th, it became clear that the ship had barely made any progress since April, meaning they were sailing and struggling with storms, barely moving at all. Even so, they managed, but it wasn't enough to spot the African coast again. Knowing that the monsoon season was approaching, Manuel ordered the ship to head for the coast. Then, they dropped anchor, and some crew members were sent to the beach to tie the ropes that would help keep the ship stable. The plan was to gradually transport the passengers to dry land and then remove all the supplies that could still be saved. And despite maritime tradition stating that the captain would be the last to abandon the ship, the first to leave São João were actually Manuel, his wife, and his children. Under the excuse that they would help prepare the camps, they disembarked, accompanied by about 20 men who would stay on land to protect them in case any locals appeared. After that, the boat returned to the ship and began transporting small groups of passengers and crew to the beach. The process, however, was slow and difficult, and it would take days to remove everyone who was on board. In fact, the Chronicle reports that in some of these crossings, the boats were violently overturned by the waves on the beach, with some people nearly dying. The next day, however, the pilot, who was still on the ship, noticed that the cable holding it in place had snapped, probably cut by the rocks. Suddenly, the São João was left adrift in still rough waters, with hundreds of people still on board who hadn't had time to disembark. Without the cable to stabilize it, the anchor could no longer keep the ship in place. And so shortly after, the vessel was thrown against the rocks and broke into 4 pieces. In less than an hour, the São João was completely shattered. More than 100 crew members died in the disaster, while about 400 survivors managed to reach the shore and join those who were already on land. After the shipwreck, the survivors remained in a state of shock for some time. For almost 2 months, they had faced violent storms aboard a severely damaged ship, and against all odds, had still managed to survive. However, now they were stranded on an unknown shore, not knowing exactly where they were or what awaited them. As the initial confusion subsided, the commander began to take action. He ordered the men to gather everything possible from the wrecked ship: crates, cargo, barrels, and any piece of wood that washed up on the shore. His initial hope was to build a new vessel using the remains of the São João, perhaps a small caravel that could take them back across the sea. That hope, however, quickly vanished. A few hours after the shipwreck, it became clear that almost nothing had survived the impact. The waves had completely shattered the ship. There wasn't even a piece of wood large enough to be used in the construction of the ship. And faced with this, Manuel focused his efforts on the immediate survival of the group. Using barrels, crates, and other salvage materials, he and the castaways built makeshift shelters on the beach. About 500 people had reached the shore with very few resources, almost no drinking water, and very little food. And for about 12 days, the survivors lit fires to keep warm and shared small portions of flour salvaged from the ship. Eventually, they managed to find a source of fresh water, which brought some relief. "What's that? What's that? What?" The crew members spotted a small group of locals leading a cow up the hill. Upon noticing the crowd on the beach, the natives stopped and watched from a distance. The Portuguese responded with friendly gestures, inviting them to approach the improvised camp. And so Manuel's group met the natives for the first time. After some conversations and gestures, the Portuguese realized that the natives were interested in trading some items from the ship, especially the steel nails from Danal, in exchange for a cow. However, after much negotiation, when they were about to close the deal, other natives shouted from the top of a hill, and the traders left, giving up on negotiating the deal. He reports that this was extremely discouraging, as the cow would have helped to nourish the crew for days, and on the 12th day of their stay on the coast, the Portuguese gathered to decide what to do. Everyone then comes to the conclusion that the best thing to do would be to go to the locality of Sofala, which was 1,280 kilometers from where they were. And as distant as it was, that was the only option. So, before starting the journey, the captain decides to give a speech to everyone. But instead of calming the survivors and encouraging everyone, he starts to cry, and he begs everyone that if he falls behind along the way, no one should leave him behind to die alone. Thus, the leader of the expedition, instead of conveying confidence, was spreading fear and dread to everyone present. And so the journey begins. The group of nearly 500 people managed to walk about 20 kilometers per day, and in the first month it is believed they covered almost 590 kilometers. Captain S.E., but at the same time the supplies were running out day by day. In this way, it didn't take long for hunger and dehydration to start afflicting the whole group. Many of those who were weakened were simply abandoned and left behind along the way. Some rice they still had from the old vessel was distributed, but they couldn't find any fruit in the vegetation, and whenever they encountered groups of natives, they were always attacked. And curiously, one of the first to be abandoned was a captive woman who was Manuel's lover, along with her illegitimate son. But since the march was unstoppable, by the time Manuel received the news that they had been abandoned, many days had already passed. Outraged, he wanted to offer money for someone to go back and rescue them, but no one accepted. Because it was a deadly journey, everyone had to keep moving forward. In the chronicle, the figure of Dona Leonor is described with pity, an important noblewoman who was very cultured and the wife of Manuel. And she, despite her fine and delicate features, managed, with great effort, to walk ahead of the others, inspiring everyone. But all this torment would soon find relief. After traveling hundreds of kilometers, the Portuguese met the king of a friendly tribe who welcomed them into his community. This particular tribe had already had contact with other Portuguese castaways before, with many of its members having learned a bit of the language. And so, the Portuguese are informed by the king that the region they were heading to was involved in a war against powerful enemies from a very treacherous tribe. For 2 weeks, Manuel and the Portuguese were welcomed by this tribe and were given food and shelter. Manuel's initial plan was to build and help the king fight the enemies. After all, they had hundreds of men and they had swords and firearms that would help the natives win the war. But his brother-in-law recommended that they leave as soon as possible because they were wasting time getting involved in a war that wasn't theirs. And when the king learned of the Portuguese plan to leave, he immediately tried to convince Manuel not to go, or at least to take a grand detour. Without. The commander, just like his brother-in-law, was in a hurry to reach his destination, and so they refused the help and guidance of the friendly king, with the whole group taking the shortest route and thus traveling through enemy territory. As warned, Manuel and his men soon encountered the rival tribe, with about 200 men who seemed friendly, and they took them to meet their king, the enemy king of the other tribe. He then promised to build shelters for everyone so they could rest for a few days. But for that, The Portuguese would first have to hand over their muskets and swords to him, because those weapons were scaring his people. Manuel's wife then advised him not to do that, since they were still strangers, and the former king had warned them about these people. But Manuel once again didn't listen to the advice, and so all the Portuguese handed over their weapons to the natives, and that's when one of the saddest events in history is described. When the last weapon is handed over, the natives immediately go after the Portuguese to attack them. Those who resisted were immediately killed, and those who surrendered were distributed as captives among the villages in the region. The natives stripped everyone of their clothes, but one of the most tragic victims was actually Manuel's wife. The natives came toward her to strip off her clothes, and Leonor fought for her clothes. She was willing to lose her own life, but her husband begged her to give them up so that the noble lady would not be killed. So after being stripped and completely humiliated, she dug a hole in the ground, where she buried herself up to her waist, covering the rest of her body with her long hair. The account says that she saw her children crying by her side, asking for food, but she couldn't do anything. And there, she would remain buried so that no one would see her naked. And in that same hole she dug, she would die of thirst and malnutrition, refusing to leave the hole without clothes. With the death of his wife Manuel, who was already not doing well, completely lost his sanity. The captain, wandering aimlessly and speaking nonsense, disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. As for the other survivors, they remained captives of the community. It was only a year later, at the beginning of 1553, that the Portuguese, missing the vessel and having no news of it, launched an expedition to try to locate the ship. And after a long time, they managed to locate the wreckage and later found a total of 25 Portuguese with the tribe. In other words, out of more than 500 survivors, only 25 had survived. The leader of the expedition negotiated with the king to buy the captive Portuguese, and they both agreed that the Portuguese would pay 1 Spanish silver dollar for the freedom of each survivor, and in this way, the survivors were finally freed and taken to Sofala. And it was through the account of these survivors that the Portuguese gained access to one of the most macabre stories of collective survival ever seen until then, forever immortalized and stamped in history, maritime tragedy. And this was the tragic story of the Nau São João, the most iconic account in the history of maritime tragedy. It's full of wrong decisions made at the wrong time. Captain Manuel stands out for being apparently selfish and trying to protect himself and his family, but in the end, by not acting as a captain, he fails miserably. But the big question is, was Manuel really such a bad leader, or would anyone in his place surviving shipwrecks for months, hungry, constantly traumatized, thinking they were going to die all the time, have done any better? Would they have made the same decisions or different ones? To what extent was he still sane enough to have taken the path he did? That's something that maybe no one will ever be able to do. Apparently, yes. You knew the story of the Nau São João shipwreck. What surprised you the most? So, leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll have access to exclusive content so that you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.